My Lords, I refer to my interests on the register. My remarks here are not about the expected extent of climate change, however fervently some may wish to introduce that topic into the debate. It is not the topic of this debate. But let me quickly address the claims made earlier by the noble Lord Davies of Brixton. I read that Scorpion report that he based his remarks on. He may wish to read it more carefully. The tale that the report refers to is not, as I took him to say, what is expected to happen in the end. It is rather the highly unlikely worst case. It's our old friend, the precautionary principle, rearing its ugly head again, and it's time we stop basing policy on the precautionary principle. My Lords, I welcome and congratulate the noble Baroness Lady May of Maidenhead on her making her maiden speech in this debate. Net zero was introduced in the waning days of her premiership, and since that bill was passed, 4 years and 4 more Prime Ministers later, there's been no impact assessment of that bill. How could that be? One might wonder to what degree the impact is seen as unimportant, because net zero is a religion rather than a logical decision. Let's hope that's not it. Microsoft and Amazon, of course, did their impact assessment, decided that renewables were for the birds, and are purchasing nuclear power stations instead. We need a critically evaluated choice in which net zero's impacts, particularly its cost, receive far closer consideration. As the noble Lord McKinley, who's not in his place this morning, has pointed out, in 2019, the Climate Change Committee estimated net zero's cost at £50 billion a year, more than was claimed earlier in this debate, and they quickly raised that to £70 billion. The OBR opined that the overall cost would be £1.4 trillion. Again, £56 billion a year from now until 2050, and that was 5 years ago. We know how undercosted government projects always are. Depending upon your assumptions, different estimates increase from that £1.4 trillion up to £8 or £9 trillion. At those sorts of sums, exactitude is by the by. Such amounts will beggar the country, regardless. The Chancellor recently expressed alarm over a £20 billion black hole. Here we are talking of speculative expenditure going into the thousands of billions of pounds. You would expect us to have a pretty high level of certainty, therefore, that net zero was going to work. Do we? My Lords, not so much. Consider just a few of the many different ways in which our net zero plan could fail. If the speculative net zero carbon models proved over pessimistic, then the entire cost will have been wasted. Or if the rest of the world fails to follow us, and my Lords, let's face it, that's pretty much what's happening at the moment, then we beggar ourselves while making the merest pinprick in atmospheric carbon levels. Or if we overload our grid because we don't overcome the formidable technical challenges of bringing solar and wind power from source to point of need, then we'll have brownouts, blackouts, and a dangerously shrinking economy. Or if the controversially optimistic forecasts on the decline in cost of the mandated green products, on the decline in the cost of wind power, on the decline even in the number of windless days by 2050, if they fail to eventuate, then the cost of net zero dramatically and unaffordably escalates. Or, if God forbid, we end up in or near to a war, belatedly realizing that our lack of heavy industry, of steel, of hydrocarbon feedstocks imperils this nation, then net zero will be abandoned, although most likely too late for us to win that war. Or, if there is a Europe-wide energy crisis, uncovering our folly in relying on the trio of first renewables, second one large, not yet working nuclear station, and third imported energy that due to the crisis suddenly becomes unavailable, then calls for a proper energy security policy would quickly lead to us dumping net zero. Any one of these, my lords, could be enough to do for net zero, and yet several are already what the situation is, with others lurking in the background. Probability theory tells us, therefore, that 2050 net zero will in the end never come to pass, like some religiously motivated children's crusade. It will never arrive at its intended destination, but there will be plenty of misery along the road. Until such time as it's actually abandoned, net zero's exorbitant cost and its overweening regulation will frustrate much human happiness, crowd out many useful innovations, and, whatever ridiculous claims are made, lead to lower economic growth. Economic growth in our country is entirely possible, whatever is said. It comes from three things: leaner government, lower taxes, less regulation. Net zero is the opposite of each of those three. From the Financial Times to academia, the view is the same. Green jobs, talk of it, is nonsense. With net zero, the economy will grow more slowly, jobs will be fewer, innovation will be in so many ways frustrated, our nation will become less wealthy. To conclude, sooner or later, the net zero programme will come to be seen as having been a tragic cul-de-sac. The longer we take to conclude that, the worse it will be for our economy. We owe it to our country to end this misguided, ultimately catastrophic programme as soon as possible.